Good afternoon, everybody. Still morning, but almost afternoon. I'm Jeanne Kohl-Welles, King County Councilmember for the 4th Council District, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to our 3rd annual Women's History Month panel. And we're going to have a great program today, as we did the last 2 years, and we're really delighted that you're able to join us. We do have this scheduled till 1:15. I realize some people will have to get up and leave if you have to be back at work. If people can stay after 1, we will hopefully have an opportunity for questions from the audience too. We'll just play that by ear. But anyway, we're very delighted to have you here. And just so you'll know, King County TV, KCTV, Channel 22, is taping this. It will be broadcast later, and they're also live streaming it as well. So with that, I would first like to thank our sponsors for this program, the King County Women's Advisory Board and the King County Equity and Social Justice Legislative Branch team. And I'd like to have Sarah Renevald, who is representing the Women's Advisory Board, and Carmela Ennis, representing the ESJ Legislative Branch team, to come forward and give their greetings.
Thank you, Councilmember. On behalf of the Legislative Branch ESJ Committee, we're very honored to co-sponsor this event with you today. And I know we have a very packed agenda and an amazing panel of speakers that are here with us today, so I'll be very brief. I would just like to encourage everybody to read the multicultural guidelines. And also we have printed copies on the table, so before we proceed with the program, I'd like to also bring Sarah.
Thank you, Councilmember Kohl-Welles. My name is Sarah Reneveld, and I am chair of the King County Women's Advisory Board. The purpose of the WAB is to raise awareness for the issues and challenges that disproportionately impact women in King County, and to make recommendations to the executive and to the county council to address these challenges. On behalf of the WAB, I wanted to thank Councilmember Kohl-Welles for asking us to co-sponsor this important conversation on Me Too and what it means for communities in King County. The original purpose of the Me Too movement was to promote empowerment through empathy. And for many of us, I can speak personally, seeing my friends and my colleagues, coworkers, etc., come forward with stories of sexual harassment and assault did empower us to speak up. And our collective voices served as a much needed wake-up call, if you will. And that generated, I think, a lot of research into the issue and the prevalence of this issue. And a recent report actually showed that 81% of women have experienced some form of sexual harassment or assault in their lives. So the WAB is excited to be part of this important conversation on this issue that is so prevalent and impacts women in King County, not only to raise awareness for this issue, but to bring us closer to understanding why our society is allowing this and what we can do to change this conversation and to recommend and identify policies to prevent this from happening in King County. So thank you all so much for being part of this conversation, and we look forward to a great conversation. And thank you, Councilmember Kohl-Welles, for your leadership on this issue.
Thank you both, Carmela and Sarah. We're very fortunate to have their representation here and also for the sponsorship of their organizations. So a couple of weeks ago, we had a proclamation, a recognition at the King County Council recognizing March as Women's History Month here in King County, which has been the case for a long time. And Council members Claudia Balducci and Kathy Lambert were with me in sponsoring that recognition. And I'm very pleased that Councilmember Balducci is with us today, who's going to say a few words, a welcome. And Councilmember Lambert sends her regrets that she was not able to be here. Okay, Councilmember.
Thank you, and I want to welcome everyone, Joint Councilmember Kohl-Welles, and welcoming you all here today. I just really want to share two things. First of all, how fortunate we are to have Councilmember Kohl-Welles, because she is a champion for women and equality on the council. I started at the same time as Jeanne, and our very first week we were going through training, new council member training, and we were having parts of the county charter read to us, and they kept referring to councilman this and councilman that. And so we joined together right away, along with Councilmember Lambert, and ran a charter amendment to change the charter so that it now says council members. And although there have been women on this council since the very beginning of King County, the language didn't reflect who we were. And now, at Councilmember Kohl-Welles is urging, we've been updating the entire county code, and we're almost done with that because we want to be inclusive and recognize not just women but people of all kinds. So, the second thing I'd like to share is it seems like this year it's a different year. It's a different year coming into March and Women's History Month. Not only with the Me Too movement, but it can sometimes feel a little bit dispiriting, like we're going backwards and losing ground. And so I went looking for this year's History Month for a vision of where we might take all this great energy that has come out of the Me Too movement and other responses to national events, and identify what we want to look like. What do we want our community to look like? And I found a quote from the Reverend Polymar, who was somebody I did not know enough about before I went looking for this quote. She's passed on, but she was an educator, a legal professional, a women's rights advocate in the civil rights movement, and the first African-American woman to become an Episcopal priest. She broke new ground in many ways. She was rejected from Harvard Law, but graduated from Yale Law, and she was rejected from Harvard Law because she was a woman. Back in the day, that was not something we were interested in, but she later published the state's laws on race and color, which has been called by Thurgood Marshall the Bible for the civil rights movement. And her quote, which I have hanging on my wall now, is, "True community is based upon equality, mutuality, and reciprocity. It affirms the richness of individual diversity as well as the common human ties that bind us together." And I think that's a beautiful vision and one that I think we can all work with. So thank you for giving me a moment to share, and for putting on this wonderful panel. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Claudia. It's been an honor for me to work with her. She's formerly mayor of the city of Bellevue and has done a great amount of work over her career and serves as an excellent role model for women in terms of aspiration and achievements. I'd also like to recognize we have Councilmember Larry Gossett with us. Thank you, Larry, for being here. And are there any other elected officials here? I think some will be coming in from the council. I'll try to recognize them when they come in. I know the judges, Superior Court judges, I believe, have a meeting at lunchtime today. We're very pleased that for the third year in a row, we've been able to have our beautiful historic courtroom here at the courthouse. And with that, we're going to go ahead with our program. It's very exciting. We have 6 individuals, which we did in our first year that we had this program. Last year we had 4, and it was just so tempting to have even more because there are so many wonderful women who are accomplished leaders in our communities. We selected the theme of Me Too because of the growing movement that has been taking place in it. And this term, Me Too, which everybody knows about now and has had millions of hits on Facebook and all over in social media, started with a civil rights activist named Tarana Burke, who used this term originally in 2006, which I did not know of. And it spread virally so much last October that it's become a term. I'm sure it's going to be in the next edition of Webster's and Oxford dictionaries, if it's not already. But it's something we recognize, and we selected this theme because it has so much prominence, and it intersects all class, race, ethnicity, national origin, religion, sexual preference. It's an intersection that permeates our society now. And of course, it's caught on in other countries in the world as well. It's really gone global. So we want to bring it here to King County. We have an outstanding panel. I'm going to introduce each of them very briefly, because on the back of your program, you will see that there are very short bios with regard to each of our panelists. I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order, and I see that they're arranged that way too. On my far right is Dr. Sutapa Basu, Executive Director of the University of Washington Women's Center. Next is Eula Scott Bynoe, who is a HellaBlackHellaSeattle podcast host, doula, childbirth educator, and equity trainer around racism and early childhood education. Wow. And she is breastfeeding her infant son, Livingston, I believe, who is here. And hopefully will be happy without his mother for the next little while. Next is Doris O'Neill, the Domestic Violence Director at the YWCA of Seattle, King County. And Monserrat, Padilla, next to her. Maybe you should each wave when I call it, who is coordinator of the Washington Immigrant Solidarity Network. Next to her is Peter Qualliotine, who's director of the Men's Accountability Program at the Organization for Prostitution Survivors. And last but not least, Mary Ellen Stone, the executive director of the King County Sexual Assault Resource Center. So welcome all of you. We're delighted that you are here. I wish we had more time, but I let them know that we'll be fairly rushed as this is the lunch hour. So I have a question of all of our panels, a single question, and I would appreciate your answering. I'm afraid we're limiting the time to about 1.5 minutes, and then I'll go on to a question that will be posed to each of our panelists separately. So the first question that I have for all of you is, in your, I'm sorry, let me take that back. We know that Me Too affects people personally, professionally, in the community, in all sorts of ways in our lives. But I would like each of you to take a minute or so to elaborate on what Me Too means to you in your personal and or professional experience. So Sutapa, we'll start with you.
Everyone, can you hear me at the back? Great. Thank you, and I'm glad to be here. Thank you, Councilmember Jeanne Coles, for inviting me. And I'm glad you mentioned Tarana Burke. I want to acknowledge her. She's an African-American woman who started the movement. Actually, she started it in 1997 and then formally named the movement in 2007. So I wanted to give her a shout out. Right now, of course, Me Too has many issues for me, but right now, right here, the two issues that I'm very focused on is one is the sexual assault to the prison pipeline, and the other one is bride trafficking. So let me just say a few words about sexual assault to the prison pipeline because it affects a huge number of women. Since 1997, no, not 1977, the number of girls and women has increased in the prison system by 832%. And in 2006, there was a study done, and what they found was that 93% of incarcerated girls had experienced sexual or physical abuse. Okay, that's all I can say. So.
Yes, we only got a little bit of time.
That's
I think
Sutapa, go ahead and finish your thought about the bride trafficking.
And 75% of incarcerated women are survivors of domestic violence. And in, did I say the 1933? Yeah, 93%. I already forgot what I said. So it's become a huge issue, and it's not talked about as much in our community. And disproportionately, of course, girls and women of color are incarcerated. So that's an issue that I'm focusing on, and I would like to see the larger community start addressing that issue. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sutapa. And Tanya, let's do it for 2 minutes. That's too rushed with the 1.5. We'll just make do. Okay, Eula, what are your thoughts on the question?
Yeah, so for me, I hope you guys can, yeah, you totally can. For me, when the Me Too movement started, it didn't directly affect me, right? Like, I work for myself. You guys heard my laundry list of things. And I have been this person my whole life, this talkative, outgoing human. Like, Larry's known me my whole life. And I told my husband the other day, I was like, could you imagine somebody sexually assaulting me? And he was like, oh my God, no. And so that's never happened to me. But what really struck me about the Me Too movement was a conversation around Aziz Ansari, right? This conversation, I don't know if you all read it, but the idea that men press up on women so aggressively that the only way to end that conversation is often to give in and be a participant in sex, right? And it is a weird, blurry line for, I think, a lot of men who are like, so I asked her a bunch of times if she wanted to have sex, and then at the 75th time, she said yes, right? And I don't think men see that as rape, right? But I can see how that can develop into rape. I have been in many of those situations. I can't tell you how many times I probably was sexually active with someone just because I was like, he's never gonna shut up. And I'm never gonna get out of here unless I just play along. I can remember being like 19 at Urban Outfitters, one of my first jobs, and I was working with this young queer woman who said to me, what did she say? She said, I used to, perform fellatio when I really didn't want to be active with a man because it was the easiest way to end the conversation. And I remember thinking like, oh, me too. And I had that feeling in 2005, So for 2017, as we have this conversation about the workplace sexism, I think too very aggressively about the conversation we're having around consent. Right? So that's probably my main focus in this because I'm not, as a woman of color, I'm not really included in the work world the same way everybody else is. I'm not like amped up when I get a career that's going to give me 30 years because I don't want to work with people for 30 years. I want to work for myself as long as I can. But I can see where we have to go back and really start this conversation as early as we can. And today I heard on the news that they were talking about Flash. I don't know if anybody here is from Seattle and took Flash growing up, but Flash was this great program where in the 4th and 5th grade we had conversations around sex ed, and they're having new conversations around it where they're trying to kind of revamp it. Please revamp it with the conversation around consent. Mm-hmm.
Good afternoon. Thank everyone for having me here today. When the Me Too movement, when it came to light, even before the major piece came to light, and it felt like it was a platform, but it seemed like once the celebrities and everyone kind of took stand on it, then it got more audience, it got more voice to it. So in thinking about the platform that it has created for the folks that are local. I work with survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault and human trafficking. And the intersection between the two is like one-on-one. Many women and men, and however one may identify, sexual assault is sexual assault, and the consent, and one has the right to say no. When talking with a lot of our women, it's like when we talk about domestic violence and physical abuse, many times women will not include sexual assault as that physical abuse. And so we are having a bigger conversation on, did you consent? Although he's your husband, although she's your husband, your wife, did you have consent? Did you give consent for this person to be intimate with you? And so it is more, for some people, it was a validation to say, this was happening for me. For some folks, it was a platform to be able to say, it did happen to me. And then the understanding that goes behind it, that one can be believed, that one can say, it did happen, and now I have a right to say it happened, and someone's going to believe me. Thank you.
Thank you. And, Monserrat?
Yeah. Good morning, everybody. My name is Monserrat. I am undocumented and unafraid, and I am also a survivor of sexual violence. My abuser was one of my first educators in this country, and when I was supposed to be studying and focusing in my everyday homework, I had to live with my abuser for an entire school academic year, never sharing that experience, primarily for the fear that if I was to share that an alteration would happen and that my hardworking mother would be at risk of deportation. Growing up, I would wonder, why me? I would wonder if it was my femininity, if it was my queerness, that I initiated the attack. And it wasn't until I came to terms with my own being, with my own queerness, with my own transness, that I realized I was a survivor. Now I know that there's over 19 million immigrant and refugee women in this country who potentially might be experiencing similar experiences. We're afraid that if it was us who initiated the attack, and how could we get out of it? And the fear of detention and deportation is one that's prevalent today. So for me, the Me Too movement, even though when it first began, I felt excluded, primarily because of my growing up experiences, I've learned to realize that I too needed to do my job to make sure that immigrant and refugee and transgender women were part of the conversation. Oftentimes, we want to justify as non-trans people, as non-queer people, why people are queer, why people are trans. And I battled with that question my entire life. It wasn't until I came to terms with the fact that I was those things before this attack, and that I was a survivor that really was able to peace my mind. Today, one of the works that we do for the Washington Immigrant Solidarity Network is to respond to the immediate threat of ICE in our communities, and that also means local enforcement when they don't believe survivors. So we're committed to that, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Peter.
So my personal response to Me Too was one of heartbreak. I think whenever I hear about gender-based violence of any kind, especially, there's just so much unnecessary suffering that doesn't happen, that doesn't need to happen in the world that we bring upon one another. And it breaks my heart every time. And when you hear the sheer volume of people coming forward and talking about harm they experienced that they didn't have to experience, this didn't have to happen, that holding that can be really difficult. And I know for many of us that do this work, that being able to hear story after story after story after story and see statistics that represent even the stories that we can't hear is a challenge. It's a challenge to bear witness and to continue to move forward. And so I've been working on issues of gender-based violence and engaging men to stop it for about 30 years. And so I was overwhelmed and I was heartbroken. And then I saw a great opportunity to be able to do supportive work, and following the brave and courageous ability for the survivors and victims to come forward and speak truth to power and be able to get beyond the blaming themselves and get past victim blaming from others, to be able to really identify what had happened to them and talk so openly, and making themselves vulnerable in that way, inspired me to do the same. And so I've really seen Me Too professionally as an opportunity to, in my men's engagement work, to be able to have these conversations. Because for once, it's all over the news. And when you're standing in line at the grocery store, or when I have a man in my class, I'm able to say, hey, how about this Me Too stuff? And invite them into accountability for talking and about what we can do about it.
Thank you. And Mary Ellen.
Hi, Mary Ellen Stone. King County Sexual Assault Resource Center is the primary provider of services to victims of sexual assault and their family throughout King County. And we started out of the Women's Advisory Program, so special shout out to you. Thank you. Let me just say a couple things about Me Too. When Me Too started breaking mid-October, we run a 24-hour resource line that's staffed by counselors. Calls went up 50% over the same time period last year. Calls have stayed at 50%, which is a lot. But what it tells me is not that there are a lot more sexual assaults or rapes or sexual harassment issues going on, because we're seeing the increase in calls from every sector, from child victims to parents of child victims to adult survivors of child sexual assault to adult rape victims. What it shows is what we know. More people are willing to come forward. More people are finding courage in the numbers of saying, yes, me too. And the need is considerable. So I think it's a good benchmark for us to say, how many survivors are really out there? We know most people don't report to law enforcement. Maybe 40% nationally of all rape victims report to law enforcement, which, while law enforcement is not the answer for everyone, that is a shockingly low number and something that we should be able to turn around. We know that most sexual assault victims, and I'm looking at sexual assault really broadly, don't say anything because they're afraid of not being believed, of not being understood, of being shamed. Me Too represents our first collective chance after 40 years of work to turn the narrative, to say, we really do want to hear from you, because that's the first step I think we can take to stopping sexual violence for your son's generation. Yeah.
We're talking about consent all the time.
Yeah, good. That's good. Thank you.
Thank you all. And what I'm going to do now, as I mentioned, is to ask a separate question for each panelist, and then we can have a little conversation among the panel if anybody wants to comment on somebody else's response. I'm going to mix it up a little bit this time. So Doris, I will start with you. And you mentioned about Me Too and social media once really taking hold in the popular media once women in Hollywood or celebrities started talking about their experiences. But of course, we know that it goes well beyond celebrity women in the film industry. It hits upon all walks of life. As you work at the YWCA and head up the domestic violence program there, what do you believe the Me Too movement is adequately addressing domestic violence? What do you hear from the individuals with whom you interact?
The Me Too movement opened up a platform, as I said before, because many DV survivors sometimes don't identify with the sexual assault pieces. We primarily work with women of color and primarily African American women, and so when we're having these conversations with women of color, there's still a shame of not being able to share what they may have experienced. It's still a shame of no one will believe me, and so at this time when we're bringing it more into the conversation than what it used to be, and talking about sexual assault, and talking about human trafficking, and so the DV piece I think for me as a director, it opened up more conversation for us to be having with survivors and not stick to just what we know of the basic of DV, but to really open it up so that survivors have an opportunity to share. Because some of it, like Marianne said, it's not brand new. Something they have experienced way back in their life, and they have had to keep it suppressed for all of this time. And so it does make us feel like we need to open up that conversation more. I think this is definitely a movement and not a moment, because now that we need to bring it back down to local, to governmental entities, to all the different entities that are out there, to really be having the conversation, not only about sexual assault, but about sexual harassment, primarily in the workplace also, because that's where a lot of it kicks in at, and women and people. I won't just say women, because it happens to all, that, you know, to have a platform out to be able to have that conversation and know that they'll be heard, and know that some type of action will be taken behind it, not just say what they mean, but be able to have some type of action in the workplaces. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter, Doris just mentioned that sexual harassment, sexual abuse goes beyond women, which is mainly what most experts believe is the case, that it's mainly women, it's mainly girls, but boys and men also experience harassment and abuse. But in the Me Too movement, what we hear about more is men as the perpetrators. What do you believe is a positive role for men in the Me Too movement?
Well, first, I just want to acknowledge that there are many male and trans survivors of sexual assault and sexual harassment, and but again, like you said, the majority of perpetrators of gender-based violence are men. Most men don't do these types of violence, but when they happen, it's men. And so men have a real special responsibility, I believe, to be able to help change the culture. So I think that first off, I think what men can do is listen, that there's an opportunity here. And I think that this was foundational for how I got involved in this work, was from the women in my life, my sister starting to talk to me about things that they'd experienced. And then, back in the 80s and the 90s, going to Take Back the Night marches and hearing the speak outs and watching survivor after survivor come up and bear witness to what they'd experienced. And that had a profound impact on me. That courage had a profound impact on me and was really inspirational for me to say, okay, so what can I do with that? What is my role as an aspiring male ally in this work? What can I do? And I think that one of the key things that I've discovered over the time is that one of the things that we can do as men, if we identify that way, is to talk to other men, to call them in to talk about this stuff, to be able, and people often, I think, will talk about calling other people out on things, and I think it's easy to get really mad at somebody and blow it up and walk out and feel superior. But I think what's harder to do still is to locate how being raised in male supremacy has damaged us and our ability to engage with other people, and to own that and to recognize that it creates significant blind spots for us, and that's going to be a perpetual process for us, is disembodying that sexism that we've learned to embody over time. And just like it's a lifetime spent trying to unravel our whiteness and white supremacy, it's going to be a lifelong process of being able to work on our sexism. And so inviting men into that process in a way that's modeling vulnerability, modeling mutuality. I just want to kind of just go over for about 15 seconds because I'm male and I feel entitled to take up all of this space.
Time's up. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say that the conversation about consent, super important. And when I'm talking to men lately about consent, I've been talking more and more about mutuality rather than consent. Because I think that when I start talking about consent, for a lot of men, it becomes just this new thing that they need to get. Right? I'm going to get consent. And then rather than I'm going to engage in this amazing mutual process of sexual activity with this other person and be there in the moment rather than get this thing, right? It's like the difference between having and being. So that was my other thing.
I wish we had more time. Thank you, Peter, for that. And Monserrat, Peter mentioned trans persons too, and I should have brought that up. But you did as well, and also mentioned the fear of deportation as being an integral part of what's going on in many people's lives right now, particularly with immigrants and refugees, especially in the era of the Trump administration. How do you believe the Me Too movement, or whatever we want to call it, could be more inclusive, especially with regard to the challenges faced by trans individuals and immigrants and refugees? That's a lot in 2 minutes.
Don't worry, I often get asked is like, what's the answer to your life questions? I'm just kidding. So, I think to first understand background that all around the world, women are fleeing gender-based violence and are in persecution of that, and reason why many of them migrate to other countries where they would feel a sense of safetyness. Now, the reality is that when immigrant women and refugee women come to this country, the reality is not any other different. And if, in fact, there's actually systemic barriers against them. So I think for me, being able to highlight the fact that we as immigrant and refugee women and as transgender women face similar experiences as other abused women, The fear of deportation and detention is prevalent. The fear of deportation and detention and deportation to the victim and to the abuser is important to highlight. I lived in a family where domestic violence took place, and my sibling, in fear that if by reporting the abuser would be put in deportation removal, never reported the incident. Now, it is important that we understand immigration and justice and liberation through the framework of abolishing the detention system. And I say that primarily because if I believe that that person should have been deported, then I am doing injustice to my community. I believe that there's already systems that put in place abusers through the criminal justice system that makes them pay their time. And for no reason, and oftentimes that solution will prevent victims who are afraid of reporting to be able to finally report without the fear that the parent of their child might get deported, because there's always that conflict. In addition, immigrant and refugee women's, and also transgender, I'll speak about the transgender part of it, but immigrant and refugee women's continue to be humiliated oftentimes in their communities and not believed. And in terms of my experience as transgender, I think the biggest challenge was being able to see myself, particularly as a transgender woman, to see myself a part of the women community and being welcome, which I think that as women, we have to do a lot more work to be able to create inclusive spaces, starting from pronouns, starting from gender-neutral restrooms. So I encourage the county to invest in resources for immigrant and refugee women and transgender women to be included and see themselves to be able to find solutions such as the Violence Against Women Act, to be able to apply for U visas, T visas, without fearing that their abuser would be put in deportation proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Sutapa, you, as director of the University of Washington Women's Center, deal with students that are of represent all demographics. And you've also done a great deal of extensive research and policy work having to do with human trafficking. How do you see this playing out in the university setting? Does Me Too come up much? Do you get requests for assistance? Are the programming numbers increasing?
It's, as we know, that 1 out of 4 young women are assaulted on college campuses. So it's a huge issue on every campus, including ours. What has happened, we, at the Women's Center, we serve all women. However, I would say about one program we have, which is a high school girls program, encouraging them to go on to higher education. 80% of the students in that program are refugee and immigrant women from that community. And what you just said, I absolutely relate to it, because many of them experience sexual assault or have violence at home, but they're not willing to come forward for 2 reasons. One, the fear of deportation of the family member. That's number 1. And number 2, also the shame that would bring to the family. So they do not want to talk about it. So that's an issue that we see or hear about quite a bit. And we do have several programs on sexual assault. We have forums on sexual assault and domestic violence. And lately, we have been fortunate enough, for the first time in the history of the university, that the athletic department as well as the football team has invited us from the Women's Center to come and do training. That's huge, because in the past, that was just, you couldn't get in there. So, that's progress. But I think, just to add to it, we still live in a society that's so prevalent in victim blaming. Unless we stop that, and that includes both men and women, we still would blame, if a victim comes forward, survivor comes forward, we look for whatever we can look for to blame that person, and we need to stop that. And the backlash, I'm really concerned about the backlash of the Me Too movement. I just want to give one example. One of my team members, we just had a big gala. The Women's Center hosts a gala every year. We had over 400 people, and one of our team members was going to go and hug one of her friends, and I guess he said, "Oh, I'm not sure that I want to hug you because of the, with all this Me Too movement." So that's a conversation that needs to take place as well, because there's a huge backlash going on, and we cannot buy into it. And as one of the panelists said, we have to call out, men have to call out other men when you see inappropriate behavior. So, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Next, Mary Ellen. Sutapa mentioned backlash, and she and I appeared on a program, King County TV, and we talked about that. Is that coming down the road? What are the calls into your center lead you to think about what may be coming down the pipe?
It's a good question, and Sutapa, I want to shift just a little bit, if I may, on your conversation, because I think you're absolutely right. We need to look at this victim blaming. We need to look at how people inadvertently, I think, end up blaming victims, and sort of for us, it's shifting back to say, when we have to remember that most of the time the offender is someone who's known to the victim. It is still, in 2018, I think, an assumption that it's a stranger or someone who's not known to the victim. Anytime I look at our caseload of about 4,000 victims a year, it's about 10%, 11% are the numbers of people who are complete strangers to the victim. So then it becomes this question of, if they knew each other, if he knew her, she knew him, or he knew him, because we certainly hear from male victims as well, what did the victim do to make this happen? And we sort of tend to default there. At some point, it's understandable, but I think what we think and what we say need to be two separate things. I mean, I think part of what is going to change this and get at backlash things is more victims coming forward, and then for us as a community to create a climate that says, "I'm sorry that happened. I believe what you said. It shouldn't have happened. How can I help?" There's no one special thing that you have to say, but I think there is this climate and there is a reaction that says that shouldn't happen. And we want to be a helpful, supportive society. I think that can get at some of the backlash, but some of this is, we're 6 months into this, 7 months into this. It's going to take us some time to figure out some responses. I don't think I answered your question,
No, that's good.
but I got my time called, so thank you.
Okay, and my last individual question for now goes to Eula. And Eula, you're involved with the media, and we know that social media generally have played a very important role or significant role in the Me Too movement. You also have been named as one of the 50 most influential women in Seattle, as cited in the Seattle Met, which I think is terrific. You're also an equity trainer. How do you view how does Me Too intersect with other isms, racism, sexism, whatever it might be?
I think so much of the Me Too movement really intersects with classism, right? So much of the conversation we're having right now is for the elite people who work in media and are on these higher up and really large viewpoints. Whereas we don't talk about like what Monserrat was talking about in terms of people who are fear of deportation, or the way people have been, are being raped in the fields. We understand now in Eastern Washington, and that's a story that I barely looked at, but I knew it was true the minute I heard it. And I think that when it comes to social media, it's just the best thing ever, right? Because there's this beautiful thing that's happening where young people are recognizing their potential because they're not able to see where the hiccups could be, right? And so they're able to really look onto these platforms and very clearly see that I have access to all, and also I'm okay the way I am. But also the fact that we're having this conversation for so many people at such a young age, I think that they're gonna, we're gonna have a lot of different, I meet young women now that they remind me of me in that joke I made about, like, could you imagine someone sexually assaulting me? It's not that I couldn't be, dragged into an alley or be abused in a workplace. It's that my personality is one to speak up whenever I see injustice, right? And so if I literally have pulled myself over before in front of a car where I was like, I'm on my phone and that cop saw me, I should just pull over. So my point is, if I speak out about all injustice, I'm totally gonna tell if you try to rape me. But I think that plays out more and more in terms of how young women are feeling empowered to speak out about anything that comes their way. But as far as how it intersects in terms of class, I think we have to realize who is in these spaces to have these conversations, right? In this kind of a space, this room is predominantly white folks, because white folks are the ones who work in this building and work around the area. And if people of color work, way far out, live way far out, they can never even have these conversations, right? If we're starting these conversations in colleges, and if people of color are not in colleges, are they included in that, right? And then last but not least, if it's about the workplace and people of color do not find themselves in workplaces very often, what do we do, right? And it's funny because I always look around a room and I'm always looking to see if there's any black men, and there's never, because they're just not included. And I'm not saying they're not a part of the problem, right? What I'm saying is, if we're trying to reach all men and start this conversation for all people, literally the only two black men in this room are, Larry, who had to head out because I'm sure he has appointments, my husband and my son. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So at this point, and I do have a couple of other questions I want to ask, but do any of you want to comment on what someone else said, or do you have something that came into mind from listening to the others?
Yeah.
Monserrat, or who? Yeah.
I want to just talk a little bit more about the reporting to prison pipeline. And again, the need for us to switch the mentality of how we talk about abusers. And I say it as a survivor, right, with this, I say it as from a place of healing, which I know many victims can't say today, that abusers should be, instead of, full force criminal justice system, be treated with a mental disorder, which is a clear symptom of the patriarchy that we live under. When men are taught to define power differently over their bodies, and when abusers are taught to define power different. So I really urge for us to start having that conversation more, so that we can, again, abolish that reporting to prison pipeline, knowing that men of color particularly continue to be at high risk and disproportionately impacted by criminalization, and also the detention system. The other thing that I would say in regards to the immigration identity, right, is that the use of abuse oftentimes in everyday cases is justified by many men saying that, telling their victim that they must engage in sexual violence in order to stay in this country and not be deported, that they must continue to follow familial cultures of just being submissive. So I think for me, highlighting that no woman or victim should have to endure sexual violence, but we must think holistically of the issue. And in terms of my transgender aspect, I think that we supposedly hit a tipping point not that long ago with Laverne Cox, but I think that we haven't even started we barely started scratching the surface. Transgender women need more space of healing, need more resources from the county, need transition-related health care, so that we can come at peace with our biggest abuser, our body. So I think that that's one of the things that I would recommend the county to consider in looking into intentional resources for transgender people to be able to heal from the root.
Thank you. And anybody else want to comment?
Well, I was going to comment on two things. So
Eula?
one, when you were saying Sutapa, that this guy at your job was like, oh, don't make light of this, is what I would have thought. The way someone jokes off oh, I don't want to be a part of the Me Too movement. It's not a joke, bruh. People are out here being assaulted, losing their jobs, feeling fear of going to work and participating in this workforce. And so if you want to make it a joke, oh, I hope you won't if you don't assault me. So, so I think that that's something, if we ever hear that joke of like, I don't want to, you're not, you're fine. If I consent to you giving me a hug, then bruh, don't make a big deal out of it. It's also not funny. But one of the things I want to make sure I say, because my mother would be like, you didn't say this, was that another thing King County can look into is that if businesses have under 25 employees, they don't have to follow any civil rights laws. Right? So that means, and like, who is more likely to own a business? A white man. Who is he more likely to hire? White folks, right? And then if he is hiring white women and white men, we're also leaving out that conversation of how we can then, or even if he's hiring people of color, how can those people then have a case if they're not held to any accountability because they have only 24 employees, right? So I think that's something that King County can really look into too. The last thing I always think about too is, my dad's on my shirt. I'm Tyree Scott's daughter, which is a big deal if you know who he is. And I find his journals around the house sometimes because he's like me, he had a million of them. And he writes about how he struggled with sexism. And he doesn't write it in like a small way. He writes it in a way of like, it's hard for me. I am totally against inequity, and I see myself constantly going back into that conversation about thinking women are put here to serve me because I've been served by women my whole life, not having conversations about what women want because I've never been thought to even think about what women want. And my dad wrote these journals in the 90s, right? And so he's not here for that conversation because he's passed away, but I'm supposed to bring it up because I'm his daughter. So I did two things for my parents today.
Okay, thank you. And Mary Ellen?
I think, Eula, you were the one who spoke about the flash curriculum, sexual health. Are there any public health employees in here? Because King County Public Health was the lead on that.
My mom worked for them at the time.
There we go, okay. So more about your parents, that's great. But that is a great curriculum, and we were involved in the updating of it. There's a lot around digital safety and a lot around consent. But here's what's important. It's not as widely used as it should be. In Washington State, we don't have good prevention programming in the schools because there aren't any standards. The flash curriculum is a great curriculum, and if you're connected with school boards or you have any influence with decision makers, encouraging schools to use some well-tested, effective curriculums to help our kids start changing the conversation is a real practical thing we can do. We find that schools are often maybe a little leery about this. They think, oh, the parents are doing this. The parents are thinking, hopefully the schools are doing this because I'm not. What's happening is kids are not getting good information on any systematic way, and we know, like anything we're trying to learn, we need to hear it again and again and again and again. So if nothing else, check out the flash curriculum. Kudos to King County and Public Health for putting that out. And let's make sure that that's used the way it should.
Okay.
Should be.
Any other comments? Yes, Doris?
I agree with Mary Ellen has spoken on, but a lot of our young people are homeless, and so they're not getting that curriculum education in school. And so the prevention piece that needs to happen is we have to meet the people where they're at. And it may be in different locations that will not be in the school. So many of our youth and our young girls and our young people, I should say, or identifying that they're not worthy, and just because they're runaways or they're in prostitution or these different ways that they may be living, that they're not worthy and that sexual assault doesn't matter for them because they're not anybody anyway. And so the conversations have to be spread across the board, no matter what part of town, because for our homeless kid to our richest kid, it is happening to them all. And so we look at social media, especially with our young girls that I've worked with, women of color, that they look at social media and they think, that's glorified, and they get to look this way and that way and be degraded in a way. And really supporting some of the girls, I'm like, listen to the lyrics, Listen to the lyrics. I know the beat sounds good, but listen to the words in this music, and then let's talk about that. Is that really what you're representing? Is that really what you really stand for? Is that really something that you want to be applied to you as a young person? Working with human trafficking, we work with a lot of girls that are in prostitution, and just that title of prostitution makes them feel unworthy. And for people who abuse prostituted women and girls, that's their mentality, that these women aren't worth anything. These kids aren't worth anything. And so it's a whole lot of conversation that needs to take place. I'm hoping that the county will put out and implement different programs and outlets so that people will have an outlet to turn to, and as providers, we are able to have the funding that's needed, because it won't just be in the schools that we're going to need to put this work out for.
Thank you. Are there any others? Monserrat, just a moment to see if someone who hasn't spoken.
I was just going to say.
Sutapa?
Just to reiterate that I was using that as a context. My team member obviously and immediately stood up to the man who said that. Yeah, and I was saying that we should all do that, absolutely.
I was going to find him. Hunt him down and tell him all about himself.
Monserrat?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's been a lot of issues that have been hit on: class, race, gender. And there's this quote I found in a restroom, which was actually very powerful. And it says, if your feminism is not intersectional, it's just white supremacy. And it's important to note that if your feminism is not intersectional, it is just white supremacy. And it's important to realize that because as we're addressing solutions, we often see these movements, these organizations that are highly funded, primarily led by white women. White women are, like any other woman, we have so much work to do. And we have so much work to do by understanding each other and healing collectively. So I urge the community to consider, especially those organizations, to build POC and in particularly immigrant and refugee empowerment programs. Not just services, but empowerments. I think that we have passed beyond the stage of giving just the direct service, but moving someone to active healing, and that starts with empowerment. Yeah, I think that funding POC woman-led organizations is important. And if you want to donate to my organization, it's called the Washington Immigrant Solidarity Network.
I'm going to Eula, and then I want to bring another point forward.
I was just thinking, I bet you there's a bunch of fantastic programs that exist in the city that I don't know about, right? Like, I'm sure that there are enough people working in all these buildings that they're doing great things, they're just not reaching the people. And one of the problems, right, is that all people of color have been moved so far south, maybe they're not even in King County. That sucks. But if they are, can't we just go to their door and offer the things that everybody here keeps talking about offering to them? I'm sure somebody is out there willing to be paid $15 an hour to work on a Saturday, to go door to door, to find out what's happening. If 81% of women are experiencing these kind of traumas, then why are we not just knocking on their door and saying, hey, I have therapy for you, that's totally free, you can find it here, there, and there, here's access to it? Because what we're realizing is there's not people don't read the Seattle Times that gets delivered to my house every day, and I don't look at it. People do not watch King County, do watch the news the same way. I work at KUOW sometimes, y'all. I'm the only person that listens to the KUOW at the station. They're we're here all day. So my point is, we're not reaching people, but if we just want to get people on the ground, I know a bunch of people that have free and would love to make some money just spreading the word on the things that people are already doing. So I don't want to discount that things are getting done. We just have to figure out how to reach folks with them. And I can go. I'll get on foot. I'll go.
Thank you, and thanks to all of you.
I appreciate that.
So
Anybody else?
we have mentioned a lot of isms, and one that we didn't touch on was ageism. And I bring that up, and also I think we should look at individuals who have disabilities, especially with developmental disabilities. From what I understand, there's a higher rate of abuse, particularly in those groups. A friend of mine told me a couple of weeks ago that her 92-year-old mother was sexually abused in the residence where she was living. They don't know who did it. And I've talked with the prosecutors here. We have a separate elder abuse program here at King County through the prosecutor's office. And it's very difficult. And her mother died about 2 weeks after that. and they don't know who the perpetrator was. It could have been a relative, it could have been an employee, they don't know. And unfortunately, in our state, even though we may put more money into it at King County and we put more money into it through the state legislature appropriations, there's a huge backlog of rape kits being tested. Now, when we think of MeToo.com, I think most people think of sexual harassment in the workplace and sexual abuse. But there, it seems to me it transcends, all of our society. And so that makes it particularly challenging. And with children, our youth, our vulnerable citizens are really prey to so much of what goes on. Some of you made recommendations already to King County. I really appreciate that. Monserrat talked about the need for more assistance with trans individuals, people of color, empowerment programs are needed. Eula talked about the challenges in workplaces where there are fewer than 25 employees so that the federal and state laws don't come into play to the extent they do in larger organizations. Eula also spoke about the need for addressing inclusion more. But just in a few minutes, and then I want to take a couple questions from the audience. Do any of you have any thoughts on that? What else can you recommend to the county in terms of what the county council is working on? I'm soon to be introducing legislation to update our sexual harassment policies and procedures for the 14,000 employees in King County. But I'm eager to hear some more suggestions, very specific. Okay, Mary Ellen.
This is not a big shiny object, but this is something we can do, and I think the county is uniquely positioned. There need to be ongoing messages about sexual assault, about sexual harassment, about services available, about how to talk with our children. I mean, again, this is nothing, we have the spotlight focused on Me Too and the issues of sexual violence right now. We need to figure out how to continue that so that we're not sitting here a year from now saying, boy, we didn't take advantage of this opportunity. People, most of our services are not the consulting nurse sign you put on your fridge, and because at some point you're going to need that. People don't do that for ours. You don't think you're going to be raped. You don't think you're going to need these services. People find us when they do. But it's to your friend's mother, and that's a dreadful story. But it's like, how do we keep this issue in front of us? The county has vehicles, communication vehicles, you've got platforms, you've got ways of disseminating information that really could have an impact, especially if it was done over time. So I would urge the council to take this on as an initiative for a year.
Thank you. Peter?
I think sometimes we silo sexual harassment over here, and we look at commercial sexual exploitation over here. We look at domestic violence over here. We look at sexual assault over here. And I think that the county could really be a leader in breaking down those silos and making the connection and start talking about, practices of inequality and gender-based violence yes, sexual harassment in institutions is a huge issue and needs to be dealt with, but it needs to be dealt with in the larger context. And we need to recognize, too, that domestic violence impacts the workplace. Mm-hmm. Commercial sexual exploitation impacts the workplace, as well as sexual harassment, as well as child sexual abuse. And that we don't get there by just looking at one thing, that we need to be able to look at all of these practices together and really figure out how we promote equity in workspaces, gender, racial equity, sexual orientation, just across the board. How are these things tied together, and how do we create a unified movement towards the liberation of everybody?
Thank you.
I want to.
Sutapa.
Yeah, I want to add to that. I think the county could do a lot
Sutapa,
more.
move your.
I think the county could do a lot more on mental health crisis that we have in our community. Most of the survivors, victims, they need mental health services, and we definitely have a huge lack in that area. So, just yeah.
Thank you, and I should recognize that the state legislature did include quite a bit more funding for mental health services. Does anybody else? Doris?
I also, for the county to be able to step out the box and not be afraid to create services, specialized services. While every citizen of King County shall be served, there are specialized services that are needed. Immigrant, refugee communities, LGBTQ community, African American community, Hispanic community. There are specialized services. I was once questioned about, I facilitated for some years African American DV support group, and one of the things that came back to me from a white person was, why do you Black people need to have your own support group? And so thinking about sexual assault and DV, it goes all the way back to slavery. And so having a safe space for people to be able to process and heal is so important in our community. When we have one group that's on Monday night for African American women. We have another one in South King for women of color. And for them to have a safe space to be able to talk about it, to hear other people of color talk about it, it's very important for the healing process. And that's with CSC, DV, and sexual assault. So for the county not to be afraid to say, we have specialized services for these communities that are different and have dealt with abuse, trauma, all of these issues that have come up, that we have these services for them. And for our youth, you know, we have to look at what our homeless youth are, what our youth are that are in school, and have special services for them to get some information and be able to receive the information in a way that's non-judgmental and supportive.
Sutapa?
Another policy recommendation would be that county manage their vendors well. For example, when you are purchasing goods and services, including hotels and motels, to make sure that they have good policies of anti-sexual harassment in place. So managing county vendors would be here.
Thank you. Eula?
I was just thinking too, I mean, we're talking so much about all of the victims having support and that kind of thing. It'd be amazing if we had a program for white men where it was like teaching them empathy, you know? That would be the most amazing thing ever. Because I think that it's really important that we keep having these conversations about how we're gonna help people after the fact, right? And we need to really figure out how to get in front of it. And also, how left out do you feel when you like go to a career fair and there's like a table for if you've had this, if you're brown, or a table for women, and these white men are sitting there feeling really guilty and they have no way to process or to unpack or to figure out how to, you know, take this burden off of themselves or learn through it, or, you know, be the advocate for all of us when they're in those spaces that we will never get invited into, right? Make a program for them. I don't have it. Peter?
Anything else?
So I do have a program.
Peter?
I teach a class for men who buy sex. And about 80% of them come through court referrals, but most of them, or 20% come from self-referrals. But the vast majority of men who buy sex are white men making over $50,000 a year. Doris was mentioning how the people who are prostituted tend to be young, girls of color, transgender folks. Like, this is an equity issue, right? And when we're speaking of transactional notions of sex and moving into beyond just thinking about consent into thinking about mutuality and making sure that both people want to be participating in any sort of sexual activity, I think that white men really need to be able to take a look at where we feel our privilege and our entitlement, because just as it's important to look at the oppressed side of the equation in terms of intersectionality, look at those intersecting identities in the form of the entitlement of white men to sexual access to the bodies of people of color. Mm-hmm. So I think that yes, we need to do more about this. We're starting to offer weekend workshops in the community as well for people who don't like to be in arrested groups of sex buyers but want to work on their male privilege.
Thank you. That's very encouraging. We unfortunately do not have a handheld microphone. We thought we were going to have one. But does anybody have a question? And we'll just have to have you speak up. Yes, and please give us your name if you'd like. Thank you for that excellent question. I'm going to have to just have a couple of people answer it so we can go on to a couple of more questions. But some of our panelists can stay a little bit longer, too, if you want to come up and talk with them individually. Would anybody like to respond to this question about disabilities and what your organization is doing to help women, especially, or people, but particularly women who have developmental disabilities?
For our program, working with women with disability, working with people, I don't keep saying people of disabilities, is that this DV, sexual assault, CSE affects them the same way, but sometimes differently, depending on the mental health capacity that may goes along with it, depending on how much trauma that was they were endured to. And so when we look at that disability, whatever it may be mental health, it may be mobility, it may be, different shapes and forms, is that we are sensitive to that. And not only is the DV supportive services provided, but there will be other type of, trying to get them connected to other resources also that supports that process.
Okay, any other response, Mary Ellen?
I was just going to say, we provide direct services to victims and their families, and we have specialized, we have staff with specialized training and background, so both the experience in working with people with intellectual disabilities and physical disabilities, as well as relationships with some of the key systems throughout the county. So we bring that to help victims.
Let's speak. So maybe you could stand up and turn a little bit.
My question for the panel I was going to ask is, under the idea that if you know what to expect and you're looking for it, it's easier to spot it when it happens and be prepared. What do you folks think the backlash on YouTube will look like so that we can be looking for that?
Hiring less women?
Yeah.
I think it'll be, if women aren't around, then we won't have problems with them. That's easy, too. Right?
Yes, I'm
Oh, the
sorry.
question was, what will the biggest backlash be, and what do we need to look out for in the future? If we know that there might be a backlash from the Me Too movement, what should we be looking out for? So my response was looking out for making sure that we're still hiring women of color. Because if we're not, or not women of color, women, period. If we're not hiring women, then we could probably get rid of that issue. But as we know, women are paid less, so I'm sure a lot of, the capitalist side of people will still keep hiring them. Because they're cheaper. That was a joke, you guys.
I think that's a good point. And you read about people. So you read about people being concerned already. Are we hiring fewer women, or in those mentoring relationships? What's happening there? I think the other thing is that I'm looking for more targeted and maybe more sophisticated, for lack of a better word, victim blaming. These types of situations are automatically suspect. This victim has no credibility, so I don't think it's going to be so overt, but I think it's going to be sort of sectioning off certain types of victims to say they're trouble, they're exaggerating, again, just minimizing all of that.
Sutapa?
One of the things that many companies are now discussing, and HR department discouraging some of the employees, male and female, to travel together, which I think is ridiculous, but that's a form of backlash just because of Me Too movement. So I was just reading some articles and where the HR, they're trying to figure out how to put it in policy, which would be absolutely devastating for women. They haven't gotten there, but already they're encouraging their employees, male and female, not to travel together. So there's another form of backlash.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of the blame is going to be on women in the
Yeah,
end,
of
right?
course.
It's going to be, what can we do to make sure that this doesn't happen to them again versus what conversations can we have on this end? But I think the backlash needs to be on, those who are abusive.
And I would think also here, and you might want to comment on this, and I've spent a lot of my career working on Title IX and sexual harassment in the schools. But when we have the situation where, as we do now with the Trump administration, I'm not trying to be partisan here, but I have observed anecdotally a real increase in terms of outspokenness about women, about people of color, just a lot of more stereotyping going on now than we had gotten past for some degree. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that that's really true, that we've seen just this escalation in the objectification and the dehumanization of others, and this more and more identities based on dominance, which require the subordination of those groups. And I think Trump is a perfect example of that, that's like his whole thing. Right, which is why I sent him an open letter inviting him to self-refer to our class, but I haven't heard back from him yet. But I do. I think that what we see, and that in some ways that terrifies me, and in other ways that makes me think we're moving in the right direction. When we're experiencing this type of backlash, it means that we're making progress. Yeah. So I want to take that and say, okay, so let's move forward, because I think that we have made so much progress, that there's a lot of work left to be done. But just the fact that we're all here, sitting here having this conversation, I think shows that we've come a long way.
Thank you. Monserrat?
Yeah, I would speak a little bit more about the retaliation on sex workers. And I say that because, as we know, trans women, because of the systemic barriers, we continue to be unemployed or discriminated in the employment workforce. So we don't even have that experience of being able to get a job oftentimes. So we're literally under a level of cisgender women, and our only economy and underground labor is survival sex work. And I think that the retaliation would fall on the part that we would try to do more reconciliation, but when we know that some survival sex workers, particularly trans women, that's their labor. And I think one of the things that we need to look into is, one, legalizing survival sex work so that there's no criminalization to it, and that they have rights to unions and resources. And until then, doing what we need to do in the county to hire transgender women, pay transgender women, trust transgender women, which currently it's a societal issue that's not happening.
Thank you. And another issue that is very related, Betsy DeVos, who heads the U.S. Department of Education, has signaled that Title IX needs to be addressed. And because of issues relating to due process for those who are charged with or complained about or brought to the attention of those who are abused or harassed, et cetera. And is this something that may kind of become part of a response to MeToo.com? Me Too. Certainly due process is critical. But what happens if we have more of a movement from the right saying we will not believe people who come forward?
So, the idea that all of these things that took a long time to be done in order to put in place that we would all have more equity, being undone by one dude and his homies, is happening, right? But the cool thing is we can see this as an opportunity for us to just get ready for when they're gone, right? Like the way that Obama came into office and the Tea Party was like, ooh, I cannot wait for him to leave. I'm gonna plan a laundry list of things I'm gonna do the second he's gone. We should be planning a laundry list of things that we're going to do to counteract all the injustice that's being done right now. We can't just sit back and complain about Donald all day, because I'm bored, honestly. I mean, he's a He's everything in the world that you could imagine a monster to be. And he's our president. So that's cool. But I say all that in the mindset of like, we have to be proactive in planning for what comes next. And I listened to this great podcast by Angela Rye is Eddie Rye's daughter. If you guys know Eddie Rye, and Angela Rye is on CNN, she's amazing. But her podcast, she has an episode called about activism in 2017, and she talks about how we need to use this time right now to prepare for what's next. He is going to undo everything he can think of. That isn't going to stop us. I got all day.
Yeah, I would.
Any other comments, Monserrat?
Yeah, I think I would just add that as Eula mentioned, the struggle has been happening before Trump.
Yes.
The struggle has been happening under Barack Obama. And I think something that I am afraid of is that these newly woke white liberals think that once we choose a Democrat president, all these problems will go away. That somehow deportations would stop. That somehow the detention system will be abolished. And the reality is that President Barack Obama had the highest deportations than any other presidents before, even currently under the presidential administration of Donald Trump. So just as Eula mentioned, starting to have that list of how can we combat systemically those issues and not just periodically, and encourage the newly awoke generation to realize that the movement has been happening for over decades now, and that the struggle for people, for women, for people of color, has been generations before us, and to not think that it just came when Donald Trump was elected.
So true. We're going to be winding up. I would like to have each of our panelists, if they have any closing remarks, to give them, but I do want to point out that 2 weeks from Friday, in this courtroom, there will be another program that will be very interesting called The Forgotten King, with the author and activist Bill Fletcher Jr., who will be talking about the 50-year anniversary of the death of Dr. Martin Luther King. Very fitting for this courtroom in this courthouse and for King County. So April 6th, here at 11:30, bring your lunch. So with that, do any of you have any closing thoughts, maybe for half a minute?
Say for the Me Too movement, I think all of us just need to believe and be supportive. If a person comes to you that have been sexually harassed or sexually assaulted, to believe.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I would just say that we're all local and that everybody on this panel is someone that you can reach. I mean, we're not far. I mean, I live in Seattle. I live up the street. So we're all local, and then when we're all having this conversation and hoping to create change. And so the only thing that can hold us back at this point is us being lazy. So don't be.
And I just want to emphasize that we need to continue to build coalition. I mean, and keep making the list, because we've come a long way, but we still have a long, long way to go. And the way things are going, we definitely need to build very strong coalition to counter it.
Like James Baldwin said, the most radical step you can take is your next one. So I'd encourage you all to keep on keeping on.
I would just say that we need to stop all deportations, period, and we must end the detention system and get, with the first step, getting vulnerable communities out of the detention system. And that starts locally.
It's been
Wait, the microphone.
It's been great being on this panel with all of you. Yes, we're local, we're here, we're working. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, with that, I thank all of our outstanding panelists and for you for joining us, and we look forward to next year. Thank you.